In the heart of the American frontier, where endless plains met snow-covered woods, and the winter wind carried a hush across miles of quiet land, a log cabin stood with its roof hunched low beneath the weight of white. It was the year 1880, and inside this cabin, warmth was not only a necessity, it was a way of life, a craft passed down through generations. The structure itself, rough, hewn and weathered by time, stood as a testament to the resilience and care of the people who built it. It was more than shelter. It was a living, breathing space that held within it the warmth of fire, family, and the quiet heartbeat of survival. These frontier homes were not large, nor were they ornate. Their beauty lay in their simplicity and purpose. Built from logs felled by hand and shaped with axe and chisel, each wall bore the marks of labor done slowly, with intention. The logs were stacked with quiet precision, fitted tightly together, and sealed with a mixture of clay, ash, straw, and earth known as chinking. This thick, handmade mortar filled every crack and crevice, keeping out the biting winds of January and February, when the cold seemed to move through the land like a shadow. Over time, these walls darkened with the touch of hands and the soot of winters long past, forming a patchwork of memory and endurance. Inside the cabin, the temperature dropped quickly when the fire died down, so families took special care to ensure the home retained its warmth through the bitter hours of night. Wool blankets, heavy and hand-stitched, were hung over the windows, and sometimes even along interior walls. These blankets served as insulation, softening the harsh edges of the chill that pressed against the glass and seeped through tiny gaps in the wood. Curtains were not decorative. They were thick, useful, and often made from old clothes or trade fabric that had been repurposed and quilted into something new. Floors were usually bare timber, cool to the touch and creaking underfoot. Some homes spread woven rugs near the hearth or under sleeping mats to keep the cold from seeping into boots or blankets. These rugs were made from leftover yarn, braided and stitched together during long evenings when hands needed something to do, and the mind could wander while a storm howled outside. Each item inside the home, each pot, each chair, each bundle of dried herbs, had its place and its purpose. Nothing was wasted, and everything in its own quiet way contributed to the warmth of the home, but it was the hearth, the great stone or brick heart of the cabin, that gave life to the winter nights. Positioned centrally or along one wall, the fireplace glowed with steady orange light from dusk until dawn. It was more than a source of heat. It was the keeper of time, the focus of attention, the provider of safety and comfort. Around it, families gathered with slow movements and soft voices, letting the fire cast gentle shadows on their cheeks as they rested from the day's labor. The pop and hiss of burning logs filled the silence. Sometimes embers would fall and dance momentarily on the hearthstones before fading to ash. Children would sit close with cups of warm milk, and older hands would reach out now and then to shift a log or stoke the coals. Fuel was precious and prepared months in advance. In the warm months, men and boys ventured into the forest to cut fire, wood oak, hickory, and pines, splitting and stacking it in long rows outside the cabin to dry under the sun. Each piece of firewood was gathered with a winter night in mind. By December, the piles stood tall, covered in snow but ready to serve. Bringing in wood became a daily ritual, done with quiet reverence. An armful at a time, it was placed near the hearth to dry, letting the frost melt and drip gently onto the floor. At night, when sleep called and the fire softened to a glow, frontier families prepared their beds with care. Feather mattresses, stuffed sacks, or thick pads of straw were layered with quilts and pelts. Buffalo hides, soft and heavy, were sometimes draped over the topmost layer. Beneath the covers, warmth accumulated slowly, held in by layers of wool, down, and love. Hot stones, warmed in the fire and wrapped in flannel, were slipped into the foot of the bed to chase away the cold. The smell of smoke, mingled with lavender or dried mint, rose gently from the fabric and filled the air like a lullaby. The warmth of the cabin wasn't measured only in degrees. It was measured in the closeness of bodies seated together, in the laughter shared during a game of checkers near the fire, in the silent companionship of hands working side by side to spin yarn or patch torn sleeves. The home's warmth was emotional, an atmosphere created not just by the fire, but by the spirit of those who tended it. The cabin held memories, struggles, and small triumphs in its walls. It remembered every storm weathered, every child rocked to sleep, every morning the frost was scraped from the windows, and the day began again. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed across the plains and rattled the window panes, families drew even closer. They wrapped themselves in each other's presence. Stories were told not for excitement, but for peace. Stories of the old country, of parents long gone, or of quiet miracles like the day a calf was born safely in the snow. The rhythm of storytelling slowed the heart and calmed the mind. There was no need to rush. Time moved differently here, measured not in hours or minutes, but in how many logs were burned before the room grew dim, in how long it took a kettle to whistle on the stove, in how many stars could be seen through the frost-lined window before eyes grew heavy with sleep. The cabin became a cocoon in winter, a place set apart from the wild outside. And as the wind blew snow into drifts and wrapped the world in cold white silence, the warmth inside held steady. It was not grand, it was not modern, but it was enough, and it was made enough by care, by human hands stacking wood, stitching fabric, tending the fire, and holding one another close. That was how frontier homes were built for warmth, not just from the logs and stones, but from the souls who lived within. The fireplace in a frontier home was far more than a source of heat. It was the quiet, steady heart of the household, an anchor that gave rhythm to the days and a warm glow to the nights. In the long, still winters of the American frontier, when snow piled high outside the cabin walls and the sky wore a blanket of stars, the hearth was where life gathered. Its flames didn't just burn wood. They burned memories into the room, stitched moments into the fabric of family, and offered a gentle constancy in a world that could often be harsh and uncertain. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the last golden light disappeared from the snow-covered plains, the fire was fed with care. Hands sometimes worn and cracked from work, sometimes small and eager to help place dry logs onto the glowing embers. The fire responded with soft crackles, a little puff of smoke, and then the slow rise of warm, orange flame. The sound of the fire was the evening's music. No instruments were needed. The hiss of sap escaping the bark, the pop of splitting wood, the low hum of flame-licking stone, these were the lullabies of winter. Families gathered near the hearth not out of obligation, but out of instinct. It was where warmth resided both in temperature and in spirit. Chairs were drawn close. A worn rug might cushion the wooden floor. Sometimes the family dog would sprawl in the most coveted spot of all, just inches from the edge of the hearth, paws twitching as it dreamed of warmer days. Everyone found their place near the glow, each person casting a soft shadow that flickered and danced on the walls behind them. Food was often prepared over the fire, turning the act of cooking into something intimate and communal. An iron pot hung from a hook in the hearth or sat on the hot stones, slowly simmering its contents. The aroma of stew rich with beans, bits of cured meat, and root vegetables mingled with the scent of smoke and pine, filling the cabin with comfort. Cornbread might bake on a griddle, its edges crisping, sending a golden, earthy scent through the air. The heat from the hearth cooked more than meals. It cooked away the fatigue of the day, soothed the tension from shoulders, and softened the edges of solitude. Children would often sit cross-legged by the fire, holding tin cups of warm milk sweetened with honey. Their cheeks were rosy from both the heat and the day's work, and their eyes reflected the flickering light like tiny lanterns. They didn't need much to be content, just the presence of their parents, the comfort of a quilt over their knees, and the quiet security that came from the knowledge that the fire would last through the night. Elders might take this time to mend things. A father, with spectacles sliding down his nose, might repair a leather strap or sharpen a knife by firelight. A mother, humming a melody known only to her, would stitch patches onto coats or turn an old shirt into a new pair of mittens. These moments weren't hurried. There was no rush to finish, no urgency to move on. The fire's rhythm was slow, and so the people followed suit. The warmth created a gentle pause, a space where time felt thick and forgiving. In some homes, stories were shared at the hearth, tales from the old world, passed down from grandparents who had crossed oceans, adventures from childhood, embellished slightly each time, folk tales about the land, the animals, and the sky. The telling of a story was never about entertainment alone. It was about connection, about legacy, about reminding one another who they were and where they came from. Children listened not just with their ears, but with their hearts, absorbing the tone of the voice, the rise and fall of sentences, the soft chuckles between lines. The fire, too, seemed to listen, nodding along in flickers and sparks. Sometimes there were no words at all, just silence, not the kind of silence that feels empty or awkward, but the kind that wraps around you like a quilt. A mother and child might sit together, heads resting against one another, watching the flames rise and fall. The father's breath might be slow and steady as he leans back in his chair, one hand resting on his knee, eyes half closed. Outside, the snow might be falling again, but inside, time itself seemed to fall away, leaving only presence, a deep and nourishing stillness. The hearth also offered small rituals of care. Each night, before bed, the coals would be banked, that is, smothered just enough to keep them glowing until morning. A flat shovel might be used to cover the embers with ash, sealing in the heat. This way, the fire could be easily revived at dawn, when the chill in the room made every breath visible and the windows glistened with frost. Rebuilding the fire in the morning was one of the first acts of the day, a quiet service done in the soft blue light before the rest of the house stirred. In a world without central heating, the fire was the constant guardian. When sickness came, the hearth was where the patient rested, surrounded by warm compresses and herbal teas. When storms blew through the valley, rattling shutters and bending trees, the fire offered courage. When joy arrived, the birth of a child, a letter from far away, a good harvest, the fire was part of the celebration, warming hands that clapped and hearts that swelled. Even the ashes held meaning. Once cooled, they were often scooped into pails and scattered outside to create paths through the snow or to keep steps from becoming icy. In the spring, the ash might be used in the garden, enriching the soil for planting. The fire's life didn't end with flame. It lingered, quietly useful, long after it stopped burning. The fireplace in a frontier home was more than brick and flame. It was a source of life, a place of return, a space that reminded each soul who gathered there that they belonged to the home, to each other, to something timeless and tender. It didn't roar with power or demand attention. It glowed, it listened, it held space for every emotion, every silence, every breath. And in the depth of winter, when the cold crept along the walls and the outside world lay sleeping beneath layers of snow, that fire glowed steady. It flickered and warmed and watched over the ones who built it, who sat before it, who whispered stories into its golden light. That fire, that hearth, it was the soul of the home, and it never forgot how to keep its people warm. Life on the frontier was built from repetition. From dawn until long after the last light faded from the sky, the rhythm of each day unfolded like a familiar song, slow, steady, and full of quiet meaning. There were no clocks ticking loudly, no rushing traffic or mechanical hums to drown out thought. Instead, time was measured by the rising sun, the creak of a chair on wood, the bubbling of stew on the fire. Each small task, each chore completed with patient hands, was part of a larger cycle, one shaped by necessity and held together by care. The mornings began early, often before the stars had fully disappeared. A gentle rustling of quilts, the thud of boots on the floor, and the soft clang of the iron stove opening these were the sounds of waking. Breath showed in the air as families stirred from sleep, wrapped in layers of wool and flannel. No one rushed, there was no reason to, the day would be full enough. Water was drawn, sometimes from a pump inside the home, more often from a well or nearby stream, cold water in a wooden bucket, balanced carefully by mittened hands. It stung the skin, waking the senses, reminding everyone that comfort was something earned. The water was poured into a kettle and set atop the stove or hearth, steam slowly rising as the kitchen filled with the scent of earth and ash and old pine. Someone would slice bread, thick and hearty, and another would stir oats or coffee, all while moving around each other like dancers in a quiet ritual, every motion practiced, every step full of unspoken understanding. The children would rise next, sleepy-eyed and quiet, rubbing the night from their faces. They dressed by the fire, slipping into hand, knitted socks and shirts softened by years of wear. They didn't complain. There was warmth in the nearness, in the voices of their parents, in the promise of a full day ahead, even if that day held only the simplest of things. Daily life on the frontier didn't rely on machines or convenience. It relied on attention, on a kind of mindfulness woven into every task. Gathering eggs from the henhouse, milking a cow, chopping wood, these weren't chores done to be rushed through. They were essential, part of the fabric of living. And in doing them, people found a kind of peace that came from knowing each action mattered. You gathered eggs not just to eat, but to nourish your family. You chopped wood not for the sake of labor, but because that wood would become heat, light, and safety through the night. Even inside the home, the rhythm continued. A mother might sit by the window, mending a shirt with needle and thread, the soft scrape of fabric against her lap a comforting sound. She might hum, or simply sit in silence, the only music the wind outside and the crackling of the fire. A child nearby might be tasked with shelling beans, tiny fingers carefully opening each pod, dropping the beans into a tin bowl with a soft, rhythmic plink. It wasn't fast work. It didn't need to be. The slowness was part of the moment. There was a kind of patience that frontier life demanded and returned. One learned how to live in tune with the seasons, how to accept the limitations of each day. You couldn't will the snow to stop falling or force the sun to rise sooner, but you could prepare, you could make the most of what you had, and in that preparation, in that rhythm, there was a sense of order, a quiet dignity. In the evenings, after supper was eaten and the chores were done, the family would once again gather in the same room, often around the fire. It wasn't always for entertainment. Sometimes it was simply for presence. Someone might read aloud from a worn book. Someone else might whittle or repair a harness. The children might play with rag dolls or sit with sketchbooks, using bits of charcoal to draw scenes from memory or imagination. There was no pressure to fill the silence. The silence was welcome. It was space to breathe, to think, to simply be. The work of the day didn't disappear at night, it changed shape. Clothes were hung to dry, boots set near the fire, tools laid out for tomorrow. A pot of soup might be left simmering, ready for a late night ladle if someone woke cold or hungry, and always someone checked the fire, adding a log or adjusting the damper, ensuring that the cabin would stay warm through the deepest hours. What made these routines beautiful wasn't their novelty, it was their consistency. A quilt folded the same way each night, a kiss placed on a child's forehead, the wooden floor swept before bed. These were gestures of care, repeated so often they became part of the identity of the home. They reminded everyone, even when the world outside was uncertain and the cold was pressing in, that within these walls there was order, there was love, there was safety. Even the harder tasks, cleaning animal pens, mending roofs, hauling water through snow, carried a sense of purpose. No effort was wasted, and that gave everything, even the most difficult days, a quiet kind of meaning. People on the frontier knew the value of enough, a warm home, a full belly, a day's work done. They didn't long for more because what they had, they held fully. In today's world, it might seem unremarkable, the folding of linens, the warming of stones to place at the foot of a bed, the careful sweeping of ash from the hearth. But in these small things there was great care. These acts were not empty routines. They were expressions of love and devotion. They were the ways in which people said, "I see you, I care for you, I am here with you." There was a serenity that came from doing things slowly, from knowing that each day would bring familiar tasks and gentle repetition. It allowed the mind to rest, to find peace not in excitement, but in stillness. That peace wrapped itself around the family like a quilt. It was in the smell of clean wood shavings, the feel of a hand-woven shawl, the sound of bread being sliced. It was in the knowledge that even when winter howled outside, within these walls, there was a gentle order to things. And so life moved on, not in great leaps or hurried sprints, but in quiet, mindful steps, each one built upon the last, each one bringing the family closer not just in space, but in spirit. It was in these small, meaningful moments, these slow dances of daily life, that frontier families found not only survival, but something even more enduring, contentment, the kind of contentment that glowed from within, steady as a fire through the coldest night. On the coldest nights of the American frontier, when the snow whispered against the cabin walls and the wind howled like a distant lullaby through the pines, comfort wasn't found in abundance or luxury. It was created by hand, with patience and love. In a world without electricity, without radiators or hot water bottles, frontier families turned to the tools and traditions they had crafted over generations, and from these they fashioned warmth, not only of body, but of heart and spirit. Everything in the home served a purpose, and many of those things were made not in stores or shops, but around the fire during long winter evenings. Thick quilts were pieced together from scraps of worn-out clothes, each square carrying a story. That patch of red, it once belonged to a child's dress. The brown square, father's old shirt, now threadbare but still soft. Hands worked quietly by lamplight or firelight, sewing pieces together in patterns that were sometimes simple, sometimes intricate, but always personal. These quilts were not decorative. They were heavy, purposeful, stitched tightly to trap warmth, layered on beds to block out the bitter chill of the long winter nights. Wool was a treasure on the frontier. In autumn, sheep were sheared, and the wool was carded, spun, and knitted into garments that would see the family through the harsh months ahead. Scarves, mittens, hats, and thick socks were lovingly made, each loop of yarn pulled with care. Sometimes families passed the time by knitting together in silence, side by the fire. The soft clicking of needles became a familiar winter sound, almost like a heartbeat. Every item held more than warmth. It held time, thought, the slow love that only comes from creating something with your own hands for someone you cherish. Herbs and natural remedies were also part of this quiet defense against the cold. Dried lavender, mint, and chamomile were bundled and hung from the rafters in early fall, their gentle scents lingering through the winter. These herbs were steeped into teas that soothed throats, calmed bellies, and warmed fingers curled around the mug. A splash of honey might be added if it was available, a touch of sweetness in a season that offered so little of it. Some families burned dried pine or cedar for their clean, sweet smell, filling the home not only with warmth, but with comfort that touched the senses in every direction. Warm stones were another quiet luxury, a ritual passed down through generations. In the evening, large, smooth river stones were placed in or near the hearth, allowing them to soak up the fire's heat over hours. Just before bed, the stones were carefully wrapped in flannel or wool and slipped between the sheets, at the foot of the bed or clutched in chilly hands. They radiated their gentle heat long into the night, creating a small, pocketed warmth that made the cold room feel more bearable. Children delighted in this simple comfort, each stone becoming a secret treasure of heat beneath the covers. For them, it was a magic older than bedtime stories. Bedding, too, was layered with purpose. First, a thick mattress of straw or feathers, then woolen blankets, followed by quilts, furs, or even animal hides. In families that had hunted successfully, tanned buffalo or deer hides were prized, soft, durable, and exceptionally warm. These were spread across beds, sometimes even worn as robes in the home when the fire wasn't quite enough. The layers pressed close, heavy, and protective, shutting out the cold that tried to creep in through the floorboards and walls. Sometimes the entire family would sleep in the same room or even the same bed during the coldest spells. It wasn't just practical, it was comforting. The shared warmth of bodies beneath shared covers created a cocoon against the deep winter. A mother might pull her child closer, a father's arm might rest across a sibling's shoulders, and the soft sound of breathing became a rhythm that calmed the heart. These were not grand gestures, but they were full of tenderness. Inside the home, people moved slowly, conserving their warmth and energy. There was no need for urgency. The outside world would wait. The routines of life were adapted to the season. Water was kept near the fire to prevent it from freezing. Dishes were dried and stacked carefully so they wouldn't crack in the cold air. Wet mittens and scarves were laid across chairs by the fire, steaming softly as the frost melted from their threads. Meals were designed to warm from the inside out. Hearty soups and stews simmered for hours, full of whatever vegetables had been preserved from the fall harvest: carrots, turnips, potatoes, beans. Salted or smoked meat added depth and sustenance. Bread was baked dense and thick, able to be toasted over the fire and spread with butter or lard if available. The meals weren't fancy, but they were filling, warming, grounding. Lighting added to the comfort. Oil lamps cast a golden, flickering light across the wooden walls. Shadows moved slowly, stretching long and soft. The lamp's flame, protected behind glass, became its own small hearth, glowing, constant, soothing. Children would sometimes fall asleep watching the lamp, their faces bathed in amber. The darkness beyond the windows felt far away, held back by this gentle, glowing presence. In this world of long winters and longer nights, time also took on a different shape. There was no rush to be anywhere but here. Snowstorms could last for days, and the wind might bury the fence lines and paths, but inside there was safety. The weight of snow on the roof added a silence that was almost sacred. The world hushed itself, and the cabin became its own small universe. Laughter still happened on these nights, quiet, full-bellied laughter that made the walls feel warmer, a joke shared over supper, a memory from a warmer season. The sound of a child's giggle under a mound of quilts. These small joys glowed just as brightly as the fire, sometimes brighter. For what is comfort, truly, if not the presence of peace in the company of love? The coldest nights on the frontier weren't simply endured. They were embraced with ritual, intention, and gentleness. Every detail, every gesture, every act of preparation was a form of quiet protection. It wasn't about resisting the cold. It was about outlasting it together with patience and creativity. There's a unique beauty in how frontier families faced winter. They didn't curse the cold, they met it with wool and fire, with slow cooking and shared blankets, with warm stones and herbal teas. They survived because they had to, but they made those moments meaningful because they wanted to. They took the harshness of nature and softened it with their hands, their voices, their presence. And in doing so, they discovered something timeless. That real comfort doesn't come from things. It comes from the way we care for each other, from the quiet touch of a mother's hand tucking a child in at night, from a cup of warm broth passed gently to tired fingers, from the firelight flickering across faces gathered close, not speaking, just being. On the frontier, comfort was homemade, and in every quilt, every stone, every bowl of soup, there was something far stronger than winter, love layered and lasting. Inside the humble log cabins of the American frontier, long after the fire had been stoked and the doors bolted against the bitter night wind, a quiet hush would fall over the home. The outside world, the endless sweep of snowy prairie, the dark line of pine forest, the groaning ice on the river, seemed to fade into a far-off dream. What remained was the warmth of walls built by hand, the glow of the hearth, and the softest, most sacred time of the day, bedtime. For frontier children, bedtime was more than just the end of a day. It was a gentle ritual, full of rhythm and reassurance. These moments weren't rushed. They unfolded slowly, as if even time itself knew to step softly. After supper had been cleared and the last dish dried by the fire, the family would gather together, voices low, movements quiet. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light on familiar faces. Shadows danced across the cabin walls, and the smell of smoke, wool, and drying herbs filled the air like an old lullaby. Children prepared for bed layer by layer. Thick woolen socks were pulled up over cold toes, mittens sometimes worn to bed on the most frigid nights. Long underclothes, flannel nightshirts, and even knitted caps were passed from hand to hand. Mothers helped the youngest ones dress, smoothing sleeves and tucking in shirttails with patient fingers. There was comfort in this care, the slow, repetitive motions, the feel of warm fabric, the nearness of a guiding hand. Then came the quilts, heavy hands, stitched and layered thickly. They were laid over straw mattresses or feather beds with great care. Each quilt was a story in itself, made from bits of cloth that had once been something else. A father's work shirt, a baby's bonnet, an old holiday dress. Their colors were faded but rich, holding years of memories in every stitch. When children curled beneath them, they were wrapped not just in warmth, but in history, in love, in the lives of those who came before them. In the coldest months, stones that had been resting near the fire were brought into the room, still radiating heat. Wrapped in cloth, they were slipped under the quilts near the foot of the bed. The warmth they provided was gentle, almost magical, like the sun had been captured and tucked between the sheets. Children would press their feet against them and sigh with relief, the heat chasing away the sting of cold from long days spent outdoors. Before the lights were extinguished, usually a small oil lamp turned low, or the fire itself dimmed to a flickering glow, there were stories. These stories weren't grand or wild. They didn't need to be. Often they were memories, retellings of days gone by, of when Mama was a girl or Papa crossed the river in a flood. Sometimes they were old folk tales passed down from the family's homeland, spoken in low tones and slow cadences that lulled the mind toward sleep. The voices of parents became soft music in the dark, grounding children in the safety of family and place. Sometimes a lullaby was sung, nothing elaborate, just a few notes hummed or quietly whispered in a language older than memory. These songs were worn smooth by time, softened by repetition, like stones in a riverbed. Even when words were few, the tone carried everything: love, comfort, familiarity. A mother's voice drifting through the dark was more soothing than any blanket. As the night deepened, so did the silence. Outside, the wind might rattle the shutters or sigh through the trees. Snow might slide off the roof with a muffled thump, or an owl might call from the woods. But these sounds weren't frightening. They were part of the rhythm of life on the frontier. Children learned to recognize them, to rest within them, to know that while the world outside continued its ancient dance, they were safe within these walls. The room would grow quieter, breaths slowing, words drifting into dreams. Siblings might share beds, small bodies tucked close, comforted by each other's nearness. The shared warmth, the shared sleep, it was a bond beyond language, beyond understanding. It simply was. The security of knowing that someone else was there, someone to reach for in the dark, made even the coldest nights feel soft. Fathers would check the fire one last time, banking the coals carefully so that the warmth would last until morning. The hush of embers sinking into ash was the last sound before rest. A final glance around the room, the tilt of a chair, the pull of a blanket higher up on a sleeping child's chest, these were the acts of guardianship. No need for alarms or locks. The fire watched over them all, and then stillness. A cabin in the night is a sacred space, not because of what it has, but because of how it holds. It holds the day's work and the night's dreams. It holds laughter and quiet, light and dark. It holds children, safe in the arms of sleep and the echoes of voices long gone. It holds the promise that come morning, there will be another fire, another bowl of porridge, another day. This rhythm of bedtime, slow, sensory, sacred, was the foundation of childhood on the frontier. There were no glowing screens or nightlights, no hurried bedtimes or digital distractions. There was only warmth, closeness, and ritual. And in these simple things, a kind of peace was found that many today have forgotten how to look for. Even as the world outside the cabin shifted and changed with seasons, with storms, with time inside, this ritual remained steady. It was a thread woven through generations. Grandparents had slept beneath the same kind of quilts. Parents had heard the same lullabies. Children would grow and someday repeat these same soft steps for their own sons and daughters. There's something timeless in that, something deeply human, the way we find comfort in the repetition, in the soft endings of the day, in the gentle assurance that all is well, all is quiet, all is safe. And perhaps that is the true miracle of those nights, not that they survived the cold, but that they turned it into something beautiful, that in the face of darkness and winter they created a haven. Not from wealth, not from abundance, but from nearness, intention, and the tender ritual of tucking a child in, again and again, no matter how hard the wind might blow. In those quiet cabins of the American frontier, the coldest nights became the most comforting. Not because of what they lacked, but because of what they held close. Out on the American frontier, beneath vast skies and endless stretches of snow-covered land, winter had a way of making the world quiet. It slowed the days and softened the edges of sound, covering the hills and fields in a white hush that made everything feel paused in time. The wind blew in long, low sighs through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, distant creak of ice along the river. And within that stillness a beauty emerged, not dramatic or dazzling, but gentle, almost sacred. It was the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted, inviting those who paused to truly see and feel it. The natural world in winter on the frontier was not a thing to be overcome, but something to live alongside. It demanded respect. It required patience, but in return, it offered moments of profound calm. A snowfall could come slowly, so slowly it seemed as if the sky was placing each flake with care. The flakes would drift downward, silent and soft, layering the earth inch by inch. By the time the sun rose again, the world would be transformed, every tree outlined in white, every rooftop rounded with snow, every fence post topped with a cap like whipped cream. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was peace made visible. When families stepped outside, whether to tend animals or fetch water, the air greeted them with a clarity that felt almost holy. Every breath was sharp and cold, but clean, filling the lungs with life. The snow beneath their boots squeaked with every step, the only sound in a world made of white and silence. The trees stood still, branches heavy with frost. Smoke curled straight up from the cabin chimney, a gray ribbon unraveling into the pale sky. There was a stillness to these scenes that couldn't be rushed. Nature moved at her own pace, and in winter, that pace was slow. The sun sat low in the sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The days were short, but full of light that shimmered like crystal. Icicles hung from eaves, catching the sun's rays and scattering them in tiny rainbows on the snowbanks below. Even the stars seemed brighter in the cold, sharp and clear in the night sky, constellations familiar and faithful. Inside the cabin, windows offered quiet views of this frozen world. Frost formed delicate patterns on the glass, feathery shapes and winding vines, etched by the breath of winter. Children might trace them with a curious finger, marveling at how something so cold could be so beautiful. And beyond the glass, the world held its breath. Deer moved carefully through the woods, stepping gently through drifts. Birds with puffed feathers huddled on bare branches, singing soft, spare songs that broke the silence without disturbing it. There was a deep comfort in knowing that outside everything was resting. The animals slowed, the rivers quieted. The ground, so alive in summer, now slept beneath a thick white quilt. This dormancy wasn't death. It was preparation, patience, endurance. And it mirrored the rhythm of life inside the home. People moved slower in winter. They spoke more softly. They stayed closer together, letting the world wait while they turned inward, toward the hearth and one another. The frontier winter was not without hardship. The cold could be sharp, the storms fierce, the isolation real, but within that challenge was a chance for presence. There were fewer distractions, fewer things calling for attention. The land wasn't asking to be tilled. The animals didn't wander far. The woods didn't beckon as loudly. Instead, the snow-covered world encouraged people to be still, to notice the way the wind played in the trees, to listen to the long, slow silence between sounds. Even the noises of winter had their own soothing rhythm, the groan of a timber under snow, the distant howl of a wolf calling through miles of emptiness, the flutter of a bird's wings in the still air. The steady drip of icicles melting just a little in the noonday sun. These sounds didn't rush. They arrived and faded like thoughts during a long dream. They became part of the background of daily life, not intrusive but grounding. Night on the frontier was especially magical in winter. With the sun gone early and the sky so dark, stars blanketed the heavens in breathtaking clarity. The Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other, like a pathway of light. Families might step outside briefly before bed, breath rising in clouds, heads tilted back to marvel at the vast, twinkling sky. It made even the hardest days feel small in the best way, like everything was part of something grand and beautiful, something enduring. Inside, the night deepened quietly. Curtains were drawn, the fire dimmed, but the world outside kept glowing. Snow reflected the moonlight in a way that lit up the landscape with a silver-blue hue. Even in darkness there was light. Even in silence there was song. Children fell asleep to this winter lullaby. The quiet crackle of the fire, the occasional gust of wind, the steady breath of parents nearby. And though the world outside was cold, the stillness brought with it a sense of deep safety, the kind of safety that comes not from control, but from acceptance, from knowing that everything is as it should be, that the land is resting, the sky is watching, and the home is holding steady. This emotional comfort wasn't loud or dramatic. It lived in the small things, a candle burning on a windowsill, a mother's hand resting on her child's back, The feel of a wool blanket pulled high beneath the chin, the scent of pine logs burning slow, the knowledge that tomorrow would come, quiet and white, and life would continue with slow steps and warm hearts. Frontier families didn't need noise or constant motion to feel alive. They found life in stillness, in observing rather than rushing, in being rather than doing. And in winter, the world offered them that exact gift, a season that required softness, patience, and attention to the quiet things. That's why winter was not just endured, it was cherished. It gave permission to slow down, to watch the snowfall, to listen to the trees, to sit close by the fire and simply exist. The outside world, beautiful in its icy calm, became a partner in that stillness. A teacher, reminding them that peace doesn't always arrive in grand ways. Sometimes it arrives in a snowflake, in a star, in the hush of a world at rest. And so, amid the white silence of the frontier, wrapped in quilts and warmed by glowing coals, families rested. They breathed in the cold and breathed out gratitude. They let the world be quiet, and in that quiet they found something precious, something that lingered even after the thaw, a sense of connection, a sense of place, a sense that everything for this moment was exactly as it should be, in the heart of the American frontier, where winter swept across the land in long white waves, and the nights stretched endlessly beneath starch-choked skies. Survival wasn't only a matter of strength. It wasn't the loud, heroic kind of survival, often sung in ballads or carved in stone. It was quieter than that, softer, steadier, the kind of survival that was born not of muscle or might, but of love. A love that expressed itself in the slow, ordinary moments shared between people who chose to face the coldest nights together. Out on the prairie or nestled in the woods, frontier families learned early that enduring harsh winters depended on more than just chopping enough wood or sealing the cracks in a cabin wall. Those things mattered, of course, but it was the way people came together, their willingness to care for one another, to share burdens, to sit close by the fire without needing words, that carried them through the darkest, coldest stretches of the year. Each family member had their role, and none were unimportant. The father might brave the snow to bring in wood or tend to the animals, boots crunching through drifts as his breath rose in clouds. The mother would keep the home steady, stirring a pot of soup, checking on the drying mittens by the fire, tucking in a child's scarf just a little tighter. The children helped where they could, feeding chickens, folding blankets, fetching water, and learned early that survival was a shared responsibility. The very idea of we ran deep in their bones, and yet it wasn't just the doing that sustained them. It was how they did it. Not rushed or resentful, not with sighs or complaints, but with a kind of calm purposefulness. You could feel it in the way a child passed a steaming mug of broth to their grandfather with two hands. You could see it in how a mother laid her hand briefly on her husband's arm when he returned from outside, a silent thank you. You could hear it in the way the family's voices softened as the day drew to a close, and everyone gathered in the same room, letting the fire do its ancient work. They spoke kindly to one another even when tired. They waited patiently for turns at the wash basin, passed bread without being asked, made space on benches and in beds without complaint. It was in these smallest acts that the great strength of the family was revealed, not in confrontation, but in care. When one member felt weak, the others offered quiet support, a warm blanket tucked around shoulders, a ladle of stew placed gently in a bowl, a story told to distract from pain or worry. This deep togetherness was never louder than during the coldest nights, when wind howled around the corners of the cabin and the windows rattled in their frames. On those nights, everyone seemed to instinctively draw nearer, not just to the fire, but to each other. The closeness wasn't only for warmth, it was for reassurance, for comfort, for connection. A child curled in their mother's lap even if they were almost too old. A father reading by lantern light with his wife leaning against his shoulder. Siblings sharing stories beneath a pile of quilts, their faces lit by the orange glow of embers. They didn't speak of survival in dramatic terms. They didn't see themselves as heroes, but in truth, they were something even more extraordinary. They were present, fully, lovingly present with each other in a way that asked for nothing and gave everything. Their togetherness was quiet but unbreakable, and it wove itself into every part of their lives. During the day, as they worked side by side, chopping, stitching, baking, cleaning, the rhythm of survival became a rhythm of care. Even simple tasks became opportunities for connection. Mending clothes meant sitting shoulder to shoulder. Preparing food meant sharing the same bowl, the same knife, the same space. There was no distance between lives. Everything was intertwined. Even the hardships were softened by this closeness. When illness struck, the entire family became caretakers. Warm compresses were gently pressed against foreheads. Broth was spooned between chapped lips. Hands were held through long nights. If someone passed, as sadly they often did in those harsh years, their memory remained not just in grief, but in the fabric of daily life. A scarf still worn, a rocking chair that still creaked. Love didn't vanish, it settled into the walls. There was something sacred in the way these families made space for one another. Even the physical arrangement of the cabin reflected it. Most families shared a single room for living, cooking, eating, and sleeping. It meant privacy was rare, but so was loneliness. You could always hear the sound of someone breathing nearby. You could reach out and feel another hand in a world so vast and wild outside that nearness was grounding. The warmth they created was not just from fire. It came from faces turned toward one another, from conversations shared over steaming mugs, from lullabies hummed beneath woolen blankets. It came from the steady trust that, no matter how hard the winter might blow, they would get through it together. Neighbors, too, became part of this circle of care. Even in isolation, frontier families reached out, sometimes traveling miles through snow to deliver a loaf of bread to someone in need, or taking in a child whose parents had fallen ill. There was no such thing as indifference out here. One family's struggle belonged to the whole community, and in that, survival became not just a personal effort, but a shared, living promise. What's most remarkable is that none of this was grand or loud. It didn't need to be. It happened in the slow, repetitive, humble moments. A log added to the fire without being asked. A child covered with another layer of blankets before bed. A smile exchanged over the rim of a teacup. Love here was not spoken of in great declarations. It was simply done every day. That is how frontier families endured the coldest seasons, not just by braving the cold or rationing their supplies, but by cultivating a warmth within that could not be extinguished by snow or wind or fear. A warmth made not of fire, but of companionship, of gentle hands, familiar voices, shared burdens, and quiet hope. They understood something many have forgotten, that togetherness is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And when it is present, truly present, even the most brutal winter becomes bearable. The world outside may have been silent and frozen, but inside those cabins there was laughter, there was song, there was quiet work, and slower mornings, and soft conversation by firelight. There was peace, not because life was easy, but because they chose again and again to walk through it hand in hand. And so the long nights passed, one after another, softened by the glow of shared lives. Wrapped in quilts, cradled by wooden walls, lit by embers and love, frontier families slept soundly, and even as the wind whispered across the plains, it could not touch the warmth they had built inside together.